Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. This lecture series, as you all know, revolves around Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's understanding of Islam, which he has penned down in his treatise Meezan, also translated into English by the name of Islam, a comprehensive introduction. So we have been discussing and lecturing through various chapters of this book. Uh, yes, in the last session, we had actually started off with the Jihad Sharia or the Sharia of Jihad. Jihad is, as you all know, is a very important topic, and there are many misconceptions which are found in this topic. So, although we had begun this topic in our last session, but we know that there was some problem as far as our connection was concerned. So, we are going to start again. There were a lot of disruptions. We could not continue in our previous session. So, instead of just putting up with the previous one in which of course there was a checkered presentation, I would like to start off once again. So as far as the Jihad Sharia is concerned, it will be discussed in the form of these five main titles that you can see. The first of them is the permission for jihad. The second is the directive of jihad. The reason that we have titled this as permission of jihad, of course, is the fact that jihad itself is something that requires permission, and it is the izn, of course, means permission. That is something which is fundamental to this whole venture. The directive of jihad will be discussed in four sub points. The first of them being the nature of the obligation, the second being the driving force, the third being the ethical limits, and the fourth being the ultimate goal. So this is the most comprehensive section of this particular topic, and we will be going through a lot of details. Of course, then we will be discussing divine help, which would mean that how God would help his servants, his people who venture forth in this holy war whenever it is needed. And of course, as a result of that war, a big issue which arises is that of the captives of war. So we will also be discussing the Quranic directives regarding the captives of war. And this is also very important because as far as captives of war are concerned, we know that the Quran has explicitly said that they cannot be enslaved. They have to be set free, either with ransom or without ransom. Yes, those guilty of war crimes, they shall be, of course, they'll be made to pass through a proper legal procedure, and they will face the court or any penalty or any punishment if they are guilty of war crimes. But other than that, normal combatants, they shall either be set free with ransom or without ransom, and they cannot be enslaved. This is a directive of the Quran that was revealed at the time of the first battle that took place between the believers and the disbelievers, which is the Battle of Badr. Finally, we will take a look at the spoils of war, which also, as you all know, is something that relates to war. It is something which is a natural consequence of war. Whenever war booty is mentioned, there is a whole directive which the Quran has given as to how this war booty has to be distributed among the soldiers, and there is a proportion in which, of course, the state will also have a share in that. And remember, in our previous times, there were no standing armies, and hence the nature of this venture has now completely changed. Also, the wars which were fought by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions were not just ordinary battles, as we shall see. They were battles that were fought on behalf of God's directive, on behalf of God, against people who were denying the truth or who had denied the truth. And therefore, when they were guilty of this denial, the Almighty had asked the believers to punish them for this, and then God's special help also arrived, as a result of which today's wars and the wars fought at the time in the times of Prophet Muhammad would drastically change. Also, in this topic, obviously, what we are discussing here is the other part of jihad, or the other meaning of jihad, which means militant struggle. Of course, the word literally means to struggle for the cause of God, but here, in particular, we will be discussing the aspect in which this struggle takes the form of an armed struggle, and therefore bloodshed is involved, and of course enemy attacks are involved. So this becomes a very important topic. Today we also know that in the international arena, Jihad is something that is invoked by many splinter groups. There are people, groups, and parties and organizations who undertake jihad. So the foremost thing we will discuss, inshallah, as we start off this topic is that jihad cannot be undertaken, and no military struggle can be undertaken on a personal level. It has to be undertaken by the state. The state authorities can only signal jihad, and that is the end of that. So we will also discuss this point, and also at the same time, we will see that the whole Meccan period of the Prophet's mission, in spite of the fact that some very grave and very harsh persecution was let loose against Muslims and believers in those times. We know what happened to Ammar bin Yasir, we know what happened to Bilal ibn Rabah, and so many other Muslims, and they had to migrate to Abyssinia in the wake of these persecutions. But Muslims were not allowed to lift arms for jihad simply because they did not have a state. It was only in Medina, once they shifted to Medina, the Prophet's migration to that place, that now an Islamic state had come into being, and only now jihad was involved. And in that too, you will see that as far as the battles of the Prophet are concerned, the initial battles were basically fought out of self-defense, because the Quraysh were the ones who were the aggressing party. But Muslims were then allowed to lift arms in return, and also at the same time they were asked that if now they fight the Quraysh, then they just don't need to curb their aggression, but they can all go on and uproot them from their land. So these are some of the things that inshallah we'll be discussing. And as far as the part is concerned in which the Quran is going to clarify all these things, we will see that as this is how the things will proceed. So I'm going to start off this topic now, and at the same time we will also discuss some of the important areas which in current times they have been able to in different ways understood, and then we have to at the same time see that how things have gone on. So peace and freedom are two essential requirements of a society. That is something that we all agree. And just as various penal measures help in protecting a society from the evil of other people, so we find that at times the same happens with nations. So nations become insurgent. So just as people commit offenses against people, there are times in which nations commit these offenses. And so no one would would endorse the use of power, as far as we know, when we can solve the situation by diplomatic means through various negotiations. But once these fail, then we know a stage may come when the use of force and power becomes essential to help and to check these nations who have become insurgent. So in such cases, it is an inalienable right of humankind to forcibly stop the subversive activities of the warring nation. So it is on the basis of this that the Quran has given us a very basic principle, and that principle is something that is invoked in the Quranic verse that we are going to see here and study here, because this is the verse which tells us that as far as the Quran is concerned, this warring effort will be undertaken on this basis. So this is verse 22 and of Surah Baqarah, of Surah Nisa, which is so in fact this is the first thing that we have to understand is that this verse is of Surah Hajj, and this is the fourth verse of Surah Hajj. So it says, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَهُدِّمَتْ صَوَامِعُ وَبِيعٌ وَصَلَوَاتٌ وَمَسَاجِدُ يُذْكَرُ فِيهَا اسْمُ اللَّهِ كَثِيرًا. And had it not been that Allah dislodged one people through another, the monasteries and churches, the synagogues and the mosques in which His praise is abundantly celebrated would be utterly destroyed. So this message is very loud and clear that unless God had given permission to use force, even places in which the name of God is invoked. Remember, these are all places in which the name of God is invoked, whether they are synagogues or churches or mosques or temples. God says that they would have been destroyed, let alone other people or other places. Even such peaceful places as worship places would be destroyed. And therefore, it is in order to curb this aggression that the Almighty wants people at the same time, if they are allowed to use force, then they can be given this option at the same time. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, it says that this war can be waged, this militant struggle can be waged against, firstly, which is against injustice and oppression, and secondly, against people who deny the truth deliberately. And of course, this is something which can only be allowed once the truth has been communicated to them in its ultimate form. So, we also know that in order to curb this oppression, this second form of jihad is a very special form of jihad. It cannot be invoked in any way after the times of Prophet. So this is specific to the deniers of prophets of God. Such wars were fought on behalf of God, and the Prophet and his companions, they were used by the Almighty, or in fact, they became weapons of his, or instruments of his justice, and they implemented the truth by punishing people who had denied them, and at the same time rewarding people who had accepted the truth. So this is the law, this second militant struggle in which you wage war against a people who are adversaries of a messenger of God, and that messenger has delivered the truth in its ultimate form, and they still persist to deny it. So against such people, there is a law of the Almighty which is stated in the Quran, and that law, of course, is something that is fundamental. And that fundamental law that we will discuss is stated in verse 47 of Surah Yunus. It says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. And for each community there is a messenger. Then when their messenger comes, their fate is decided with justice, and they are not wronged. So this is a very specific and special law, as I said. This is specific to the messengers of God. Any struggle which is to be undertaken to punish people for not accepting the truth was only and only the prerogative of God's messengers, and they too could not have done it unless they were given permission by the Almighty. So we have to understand that this specific part of jihad, or this specific form of jihad in which militant struggle is waged against people who deny the truth, this was solely the prerogative of God's messengers. And of course, as a result of God, He is going to punish people for denying the truth in this world through His messengers, and again in the hereafter. But in the post-prophetic era, the era in which we are living, this law cannot be invoked because it relates to God's messengers. So today, the only form of jihad which is allowed, which is still in operation, is against persecution and oppression. And that persecution and oppression, of course, as we have already pointed out, will only be undertaken once negotiations fail, once diplomatic ties are not able to influence the nation who is persecuting. And that persecution could, of course, be against its own citizens, whether they are Muslims or not. So that is immaterial. God does not allow persecution on His earth. The Quran says, "Wal fitnatu ashaddu min al-qatl." The word fitna here is actually used to connote persecution, and persecution is something which the Almighty says is worse than murder. It is worse than killing someone. Such is the nature of that. So it is just to curb this persecution that the Almighty says that if at all it is needed, then it is something that has to be done. It has to be undertaken by state authorities. And one more thing which is important is it should not be a suicide mission, because if you're not able to curb a warring nation or a persecuting nation because of the fact that you are not sufficiently equipped, you are not sufficiently in a position to stop that nation vis-a-vis your own military might, then this again is something that must not be undertaken, because wars, such armed conflicts, they are meant to stop warring nations, and they're not meant to be suicide missions in which you know that you'll be losing your own people much more than the warring nation. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, we will take a look at some of these important areas. But the Quran is very explicit. It says that once this truth is communicated to the people around the messenger, then they are put to the sword if they don't accept. But as I've just repeatedly said, that as far as this part of the whole statute is concerned, of jihad is concerned, it was specific to God's messenger. So now we will, after this general introduction, take a look at the issue of the permission of jihad. So as far as this permission of jihad is concerned, we will see that in Surah Baqarah, or in Surah Hajj, in fact, this permission is granted, and this is how these words of this permission can be read. So this is Surah Hajj, verses 39 and 40. The words are: أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ الَّذِينَ أُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ إِلَّا أَنْ يَقُولُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ. Permission to take up arms is hereby granted to those who are attacked, because they have been oppressed, and God indeed has power to help them. Those who have been unjustly driven from their homes only because they said, "Our Lord is Allah." So you can clearly see that this verse is the permission verse which is found in the Quran. It gives that basic isn't, as the Quran says, or permission, which means that now that Muslims have been attacked, of course, that was the time when the Quraysh were attacking the Muslims, and at the same time, it is said that they were driven unjustly from their homes. Now that they are able to establish uh, a state in Medina, now they can retaliate, and that they can retaliate. And once that retaliation starts off, it's not just going to end by ending self-defense or measures which are enough to curb the warring nation. More than that, the Quran says now the war will go on and continue and take its course, and now until the fitna or persecution let loose by the Quraysh is totally uprooted. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, it is says that this is the first verse in which the companions of the Prophet, they were given this permission to take up arms. And remember, the words which the Quran has used are bi annahum zulimu, which means they have been oppressed, they have suffered injustice, and that is why this permission has been given as far as the Quran is concerned. But the important thing which I would like to also once again bring before you here is that as far as the Quran is concerned, it is explicit. It has given this directive only and only once the Prophet had established a state of Medina. In Mecca, we know that the persecution let loose by the Quraysh was far worse, because Muslims were living right beside them, but they were not allowed to take up arms. In fact, they were told "Kuffu aydiyahum," which means that they must withhold themselves until that time arrives. And this is also stated, the fact that war can only be waged by the state, in a very famous narrative of the Prophet. And I'm just going to look at that narrative before you. This narrative is found in the Al-Jami' al-Sahih of Imam Bukhari. It says, "Innamal imamu junna yuqatalu min waraihi wa yuttaqa bihi," which means a Muslim ruler is the shield of his people. An armed struggle can only be carried out under him, and people should seek his shelter for themselves in war. This again shows how important it is to underscore the fact that war cannot be waged except by the state. No organization, no group of people, and this is something which is happening rampantly today all over the world. Many Muslim splinter groups, they undertake this war or this militant struggle not only against people who are persecuting them. That is one category. But another thing is that they mix up these two categories, in which they think that they still have the power to punish people who do not accept Islam. As I said, this is a misnomer. Even the prophets of God never fought for this cause. For them, the cause was that God had told them to punish people for denying the truth. That was punishment meted out by God. And the second important thing is that in this regard, any group or organization does not have this right. And if they do so, they are exceeding their rights. They are violating basic human rights if they do so. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, we have to understand that the basics of this directive of jihad must be understood in the right sense. So, these bases are found in Surah Baqarah verses 190 and 192. They give us the correct understanding of how this jihad has to be conducted. So these are verses 190 to 194. I'm just going to read out the translation for shortage of time. And it says, "And fight in the way of God and those who fight against you, and do not transgress bounds in this fighting. Indeed, God does not like the transgressors, and kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out of the place from which they drove you out. And remember, persecution is worse than carnage." This is the verse I was referring to. Al fitnatu ashaddu min al qatl, which means that persecution is such a grave sin that it is graver than killing someone. So, I mean, we could have imagined that killing is perhaps the gravest crime that a person can commit after polytheism, of course. But the Almighty says persecution is far worse. And the word persecution actually means that you are not allowing people to practice their ideology of religion, and you're forcing them to give up their own ideology. So this is what the Quran says. It's a crime which is worse than carnage. It's a crime worse than murder, because now you're not allowing people to express themselves as far as their faith is concerned. And that has to be noted. And then the verses go on to say, "But do not initiate war with them near the holy Kaaba unless they attack you there. But if they attack you, put them to the sword without hesitation. Such believers deserve this very punishment. However, if they desist from this disbelief, Allah is forgiving and merciful. And keep fighting against them until persecution does not remain. And in this and Allah's religion, in this land, Allah's religion reigns supreme. But if they mend their ways, then you should know that an offensive is only allowed against the evildoers. A sacred month for a sacred month. Similarly, other sacred things too are subject to retaliation. So if anyone transgresses against you, you should also pay back in the same coin, and have fear of Allah, and keep in mind that Allah is with those who remain within the bounds set by Him." So this is the basic directive, viewers, which has been given by the Quran. And as far as this basic directive is concerned, it is something that has to be understood. That once the permission to wage jihad in the verses of Surah Hajj, as stated earlier, as we have just seen earlier, a detailed directive regarding jihad has been basically revealed in these verses. And all other ones which mention jihad actually are subservient to this passage. This is the main passage in which the permission or which the directive of jihad is discussed. And this arose once the Muslims set about following this directive. The context, I'd like to explain this context of this verse as well. So the context of the verses which I have just read out before you is that the Quraysh realized, or Muslims, I mean, in fact, what happened was that once they had their roots firmly planted in the land of Medina, Muslims had this yearning to offer Hajj, because this was something that they were not allowed to do so when they were in Mecca. So they realized that if they offer Hajj, the Quraysh would not allow them to do so, and they would be an impediment to this Hajj. So if they offered resistance, matters could reach an armed conflict. This was something which was on the cards. It was like a writing on the wall. And as a result, the sanctity of the sacred months will be violated. We know that the Hajj is offered in the sacred months, and we know that war is prohibited in these sacred months. So when a question was asked on this issue, the Quran replied that their sanctity cannot be violated. However, if the Quraysh take the initiative, and you just cannot take the initiative, Muslims cannot take the initiative, but if the Quraysh take the initiative, the Quran says that now Muslims, they can fight against them and they can crush their resistance. And this is what the context says. However, the directive does not end here. If you recall, I will just display the verses before you once again. It says that once you are doing that, remember فَإِنِ انْتَهُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ وَقَاتِلُوهُمْ حَتَّى لَا تَكُونَ فِتْنَةٌ وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ لِلَّهِ. Look at the last lines of this citation, that it says that if they desist from disbelief, Allah is forgiving and merciful, and keep fighting against them until persecution does not remain. And in this land, Allah's religion reigns supreme. So this is the ultimate goal, that if they do not allow you to do Hajj when you when you enter the premises of the Holy Kaaba and they fight, in the first place, you cannot take the initiative. But if they fight, you can fight back. And this fight back would not just to be to the extent that you curb their resistance or you crush their resistance, but it will go on to totally uproot them from the land. And as the Quran says, وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ كُلُّهُ لِلَّهِ, or وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ لِلَّهِ, which means that one religion, which is the religion of Islam, it will reign supreme in the land of Arabia. So, such is the importance of this very important holy act. So, now we will look at some of the important areas regarding this directive of jihad, and the first and foremost would be the nature of this obligation. And the first thing which is evident from this nature of obligation is that if they resist them in offering Hajj, but the Quran says that they should fight them until the persecution perpetrated by them is totally uprooted. Now, this was a very, very huge responsibility, we can understand, and could not have been imposed on an Islamic state without giving due consideration to its moral and military might. Thus, the Quran has explained that the aspect had been taken into account, and as the extent of responsibility may vary in different phases of the Prophet's struggle. So, the important thing is that you could not have entered into this responsibility or discharging this responsibility without realizing your own military might. And the Quran said initially that this military might would be sufficient if there is a ratio of 1:10 between the Muslims and the disbelievers. So if the disbelievers outnumber them 10 times, the Almighty said that in the initial phases, when Muslims were strong in faith and they were few, but they were pure in their faith, God says that even if they are outnumbered 10 times, then they can still go ahead because the remaining part is going to be supplied by the Almighty Himself. Now, as far as the Quran is concerned, it says that immediately after that, as people entered the folds of Islam, all kinds of people, of course, entered with having different degrees and extent of faith. And now the Quran said that this responsibility, which was initially 1:10, is now reduced to 1:2. So let me just see how the Quran has cited this in a very, very effective way. It says that although you have been given this responsibility, but it cannot be in a way that you should understand that. So first of all, as far as the nature of this obligation is concerned, the Quran says, believers arouse, the Prophet roused the believers to wage war. If there are 20 amongst you, patient and persevering, they will subdue 200, which of course comes out to be 1:10. If 100, they will subdue 1,000 of the disbelievers, for these are a people without insight. This again shows that how important insight is. If you understand your commitment and responsibility, it gives a frail body the power, the might to face a huge army. You can crash against a mountain, you can crush a mountain by your strong faith. And that is precisely why the Almighty said in the initial stages, if you are 1:10, remember these are companions of the Prophet who are being addressed, that if they are 1:10, their enemy outnumbers them 10 times, even then they will prevail on them. But later on, as new people entered the folds of Islam, the Quran actually reduced this responsibility. And this responsibility was actually something that can be seen from the very verse of the Quran in which this relief is given, and that is, at this time, however, God has lightened your burden because He knows that some weakness has come into you. So if there are 100 of you patient and persevering, they will subdue 200. And if 1,000, they will subdue 2,000. With the permission of God, and in reality, God is with those who patiently persevere. So now you can see, viewers, that this responsibility is drastically reduced. It was initially 1:10, and now it is reduced to 1:2. And this also shows how the Almighty imposes His responsibility according to the strength of people. Initially, the faith they had, the power they had as a result of that faith was far more. It was as if 1:10. They would still prevail if they were outnumbered by 10 times. But later on, the Quran said, now it cannot be the same. Your responsibility is reduced, and now if your enemy is twice your number, then still you will prevail. But remember, this is for the companions of God. This gives us this basic instruction that our military might must be kept into consideration. And remember, These were noble souls. These were companions of the Prophet. About them, it was said that 1:2 is something that they must reckon for as far as wars are concerned. And of course, until the end of the Prophet's life, this is the ratio that remained. But after that, of course, the Quran has silent. It has not given any directive because this is specifically for them. So we can clearly see that how important military might is, how important this ratio is, and this war cannot be conducted by disregarding the weaponry you have, the armor you have, the ammunition you have, because as I said, such wars which are meant to curb oppression, to curb persecution, they have to be won. Otherwise, they will result in much more casualties than the ones they are trying to stop. So now we go on to the next part. As far as the Quran is concerned, it tells us that this responsibility is something that will now cater for some of the important areas of the Muslim policy. And also we know that as far as the jihad is concerned, a similar policy was adopted by the Almighty regarding the extent of requirement that arose in wars that the Muslims had to fight. In the battles of Badr, Uhud, and Tabuk, which are, of course, the initial battles, the responsibility was much more, and each Muslim was required to present his services as a combatant. So I have already explained this, that there were no standing armies. It's not that just as today we have these standing armies, they are just called upon whenever the need arises, and they are paid people. This was not the case in the times of the Prophet. It was much later that standing armies came into action. So people, normal, common believers, they were asked to wage war whenever the time would arise, and that too in a manner that they would have to bring their own weapons, their horses and their camels, and as a result partake in this noble thing. So they were told that if they hold their life, wealth and kin dearer than jihad, they should wait for Allah's decision against them, who would punish them if they are trying to shirk this responsibility. But in military campaigns in which it was not necessary that each Muslim offer his services, the Almighty said that as far as Muslims are concerned, though presenting oneself for carrying out jihad carries a great reward, but by no ordinary means, and it was not compulsory for each Muslim to participate. So unless there was a call for jihad, which in technical terms is called nafir aam, which means the government now gives a call that it wants every single person to come and pool in. Unless that happened in the times of the Prophet, if this has not happened, then people were given this option. But in the first case, if they were not following the directive, then they would be held accountable for the Almighty. So as far as the Quran is concerned, it also tells us that the important thing here is not just the percentage of people who are going to commit in any way, and they are to be told that as far as life is concerned, it is much more important to have it protected, and the things that have to be understood are equally important. So as far as these verses are concerned, I am now going to present before you the responsibility that is also undertaken as a result of that. And this nature of obligation is now presented in the form of Quranic verses, which are verses 95 and 96 of Surah Nisa. So it says, "Not equal are those of the believers who sit at home without any genuine excuse, and those who strive hard and fight in the cause of Allah with their wealth and their lives. Allah has given preference by a degree to those who strive hard and fight with their wealth and their lives above those who sit at home. Truly for each Allah has made a good promise, and truly Allah has preferred those who strive hard and fight above those who sit at home by a huge reward. High status in forgiveness and mercy from Him, and Allah is ever forgiving and very merciful." So, as far as these verses are concerned, we have to understand that they give a very important message. The first thing that they tell us is that even if the sole ground for jihad, to wage jihad in these times is oppression and injustice or persecution, there exists a particular case, and jihad never becomes obligatory. It never becomes mandatory unless the military might of the Muslims, it comes to a certain extent. I have just pointed out that in the times of Prophet Muhammad, it was 1:2. That was the last ratio that had been given. But in later times, it is something that we have to decide. But it can never exceed this, because remember, these were Uh, these were people who were noble souls, people who were companions of the Prophet, and in no way can their faith be matched. So the Quran has given a similar directive to Muslims of the Prophet's times in the following words, and it says, "And muster against them all men and cavalry at your disposal, so that you can strike terror into the enemies of Allah and of the believers and others besides them who may be unknown to you, though Allah knows them. And remember, whatever you spend for the cause of God shall be repaid to you, and you shall not be wronged." So this is the first stipulation, that war has to be done. In this case, you have to muster all your strength. "A'iddu lakum mastata'tum," which means that as far as your military might is concerned, you should keep that to a very high level, so that the enemies of the state and the enemies of God, they are kept in check, because this itself is a deterrent. Secondly, abstaining from taking part in jihad, it only becomes a crime when a Muslim sits at home in spite of the fact that a call is given by the state. So this is the second important implication of these verses. And thirdly, deserting the battlefield of jihad is totally forbidden. You just cannot show your back in the field of jihad. Whenever this takes place, it is a sign of extreme cowardice and feebleness. It is tantamount to showing distrust in God. It is tantamount to showing distrust in God and giving priority to one's own objectives. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, it has said this out very clearly. So, viewers, I'm not going to go any further today because I would like you to have these very important points at your disposal. You must fully digest them. That as far as jihad is concerned, remember the word jihad literally
Yeah,
means
have you
it literally means struggle. But one form of that jihad in which that struggle takes the form of an armed conflict, it is called qital. And it is here that these directives are given. And remember, this qital or armed conflict is divided into two in the Quran. One against the deniers of the truth, which was specific to God's messengers, and two against persecution and injustice. Of course, in the times of the Prophet, both these types of jihad existed, because persecution was also there, and people who had intentionally denied, they were also there. But today, the only operative of these two forms of jihad is the one which is against persecution and injustice. But remember, as far as the first of these is concerned, in which you deny the truth and as a result you are attacked, then this is what the Quran says is something that you cannot do. As it is often said that Islam was spread by the sword, and people think that when the Sahaba waged war against the Romans and the Persians, they thought that they are expanding the territory of Islam, which is basically Arab imperialism, or they are just trying to conquer the world. This is an erroneous understanding of the Quran. When the Sahaba attacked the Romans and the Persians, or the Byzantiums, as we call the Romans, so we know that this was done to complete the mission that had been started off by God's messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He had delivered the truth to these nations, and now they were guilty of deliberate denial. So remember, it was not any confusion that was there in their minds. It was a deliberate denial. It was a denial in which they had intentionally taken to the fact that we will not accept the truth because it is against our own liking. So for such people, he was deputed, and this is why the Romans and the Persians were attacked. It's what was not for any other reason. But as we have also understood, that this is a law which relates to God's messengers solely. So it cannot be invoked in later times. In later times, only this form of jihad is something that can be done, in which you are waging war against persecution. The second important thing that we have learned and discussed today is that jihad cannot be waged without the state. I've already referred to the fact that if it was against persecution and injustice in the absence of a state, then the best place would have been Mecca. So the Prophet spent more than a decade in Mecca, but not once was he allowed to lift arms. Not once he and his companions were allowed to lift arms, because of the fact that a state was not established. And therefore, the verses which in the Quran invokes or states as far as jihad or qital is concerned, they are ones who address the Muslims in their collective capacity. They address the Muslims in their collective capacity, and that collective capacity manifests itself in the form of the ruling party. So, which in other words means that it is the rulers who will give this signal. And we have just seen also how in Al Jami' Sahih of Imam Bukhari, the Prophet has explicitly said that war can only be waged behind the Imam, which of course is the ruler of the Muslims. And the third important thing that we have learned is that jihad or militant struggle cannot be waged by disregarding your own military position or status. If you're not in a position to curb the persecution of a country because of a lack of military might or your weapons and ammunition, then it is not imposed on you. It never becomes mandatory. The only mandatory part of jihad is one in which the state gives call to every single individual. Only then it is something that it becomes mandatory. Otherwise, the jihad which is undertaken today in the form of a militant struggle through standing armies who are in service, of course, that is something which is their duty, they have to do. But it cannot be in any way a suicide mission in which you just lose your own people instead of curbing the oppression that has been let loose by the person by the country against which the attack is made. So, inshallah, in our future sessions, we will be taking up some of the very other important areas in which we need to be very clear about this very misconceived doctrine. And inshallah, we'll try to clarify that. And now, if you have any questions regarding what we have just discussed, please raise them.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for a beautiful explanation of this very important subject. We already have questions coming in. So the first question is from Sania Amer. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. In the present time and current situation of Palestine, what type of armed warfare is obligatory for us on Muslims?
Well, as I just said, I mean, first of all, you have to see if any persecution is being let loose. That is the first thing. If the diagnosis is that yes, persecution is there, then the second important thing is that negotiations and diplomatic ties have to be initiated. Remember, today we are not just living independently. All warring nations, or all, or major part of the nations of the globe, almost 200 of them, they have signed a no-war treaty, and that is in the United Nations Charter. So what is going on today in Palestine is not an external conflict in which some country is attacking someone. It is basically two factions within the country which are at war. So therefore, in this matter, obviously, we have to study the whole milieu, the whole background. And remember, it's not just a simple political struggle that is going on. Yes, there is a big part of that. But the second important thing is that in this regard, the Jews have their own worldview, their own Weltanschauung, in which they think that the second temple, or the third temple, in fact, is going to be built once the whole land is going to be conquered by them, because the Messiah will only return at that time. So now they got a chance to do that once the Hamas, if it is rightly understood that it was the Hamas who had initiated these attacks. And so therefore, these attacks are something in which we have to understand that the whole issue of these attacks was an internal conflict between two nations. But people who are sitting outside, of course, especially people like the world powers, they have to play their role. And Muslims have to exert their pressure as far as they can. But as you can all see, today we are like spineless people who seldom have that grit. And even if they have that grit to do so, we don't find that the warring country, in this case the Israelis who are persecuting the Palestinians, they don't have any say. And even if the United Nations takes a step, even then they don't listen. So, I mean, it is the collective duty of the rest of the Muslim states to get together and see if they can do something to ward off this attack by maybe coming together and threatening them that if they continue with this persecution, then they will do so. But unfortunately, this is not the case, because all the rest of the Muslim bloc, they are divided and they don't have any single policy. So if that is not to happen, then the other thing is that as far as we are concerned, sitting in our homes, of course, we feel helpless and at the same time very, very frustrated. Then what we can do here is that as far as we can try to help out the oppressed and the and the miserable conditions that they are facing by sending as much supplies as we can. For example, uh, the uh, the food that we can give, the tents that we can give, or any medical help that we can give. And other than that, as common Muslims, we can do nothing else. Yes, one thing that I would definitely suggest is to understand the philosophy and the very deeply rooted, uh, I would say, war mind which is facing the two. The Hamas, which is of course is an organization which has its own philosophy and its own worldview, and of course the attacking, or the chance which has been given to attack them, is another view in which of course they were just, I mean, they were just lying dormant, and now they are being given this chance to realize their dream, which I said is that the creation of a Jewish homeland in which the Messiah would come and build their temple. So we need to also understand the Jewish point of view. It's not just plain militancy as we think. It's not just acquiring power or killing people or killing boys and girls. They think it's their holy duty to create that land. And for this, if young children are being killed, they think it's a collateral damage that has to be paid, because the third Messiah, the third temple has to be built by the Messiah, and he's going to come and he's going to establish peace in the world. So you see, whilst doing what we can to help our brethren there, the point of view of the Jews must also be understood. Of course, we don't agree with that, but we have to also be empathetic that what they are doing is, if we think that it's blatant oppression and injustice, of course that it is. But you see, how does a person become so callous and hard-hearted that he would go on and kill children for that? So we have to understand, it is again the religious mind which is there. That religious mind tells them that this is an area they have to occupy to build their own temple. And if there are women and children who are being killed, it is like a collateral damage that has to be entertained, that must take place, because there is no other way out. So this will give us some idea of how they are thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Please raise your hands if you have any more questions, or send me the questions in the chat. Meanwhile, I have a question. For example, the current situation going on in Palestine. As you said earlier, that Allah told the Muslims in Makkah to not wage a war against the Quraysh, the persecutors. Okay, so in this time, what should a country or a small group of people who are being persecuted by a larger group of people, what should they do? Should they just hold on? Because at the Prophet's time there was hope, because the Prophet was there. So they had the Prophet, and they knew that there is a better
Right.
days are coming. But in this situation, we don't know if better days are coming. So what should the nation do?
I think, and still, one important thing that has to be realized, and which both sides have not accounted for in any way, and both sides are equally guilty, perhaps. And that too, what I'm saying is based on the news that is coming in, because one thing is that we are basing our views on the news which is coming in, and one thing is that maybe the news is not correct. But as far as the news that we now know, which with some credibility, is that the basic wrongs which the two have committed is that they have attacked civilians. The Hamas has done so, and similarly, we know that the warring Israelis they are continuing to do so. They are killing civilians, they are killing non-combatants. So this is a grave crime. You just cannot wage war against non-combatants in the presence of standing armies. And the Hamas did so when it took the initiative and killed people who were civilians. And of course, this is something which they are now doing in retaliation. So the first thing that has to be given up, at least by the Muslim side, is that no militancy should be undertaken. If people are being killed, that remember we have paved the way to them. We have given them the opportunity to do so, because once you give someone the opportunity to attack you, he's not going to stay silent. And secondly, we have to look for peaceful solutions, and that is something which the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose former head Yasser Arafat got to understand much later in his life. Initially, the PLO was also a militant organization, and so is Hamas now. So unless this militancy is stopped and peaceful measures are adopted, we just cannot go on. And I've also been referring to the fact that, you see, you have to look at this issue in the backdrop of the whole history, in which years and years ago, in 1948, there was a resolution by the UN in which it said that it would divide the land of Palestine into three parts. We will have Jerusalem, we would have Palestine, and we would have one Israeli state, we would have a Jewish Israeli state and a Muslim Palestinian state, and a third state which is called or organized or a area which was called the International City of Jerusalem. So that would be given an equal, equally given access to by all the three denominations. So Muslims, Jews, and Christians, they would be given equal access to the city of Jerusalem, and we'll have. Other than that city, we'll have two states, one belonging to the Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and the other to the Palestinian Muslims. But they never accepted this. And we had subsequent wars in which land was lost one after the other. So you see, if you look at the history, the way we have been tackling these things, unless the political leadership there mends its thinking, stops any such ideas in which it thinks that militancy is the only solution, the common man is bound to suffer. So I think the common man has to understand that their own leaders are actually not doing them a good service by indulging in this militancy. So as until the time that they realize this mistake, I see no hope. And if you're doing something which is against norms, then how can there be hope?
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Salman Aziz, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Sir, one of the major difference in the Farahi or Ghamidi school of thought and the other fiqh is that generally, while translating that particular ayah, you say that the peace prevail in this land, probably the Arabian Peninsula. But the same ayah is interpreted by other fiqh as complete world, that they have to make the whole world an Islamic difference.
Right.
So why do the Farahi or Ghamidi school of thought just said that in this particular land, that the Arabian Peninsula?
Right. Actually, we'll be discussing that in one of our future sessions. But just to give you a very brief answer, you see, if you look at all the Quranic verses, and you collect all these Quranic verses in which this war is discussed, that you have to wage war against these people, you'll see that it is qualified by certain words which make it absolutely specific to the land of Arabia. For example, if you look at Surah Saf, it says, "Huwallazi arsala rasulahu bil huda wa dinil haq liyuzhirahu ala dini kullihi walau karihal mushrikun." So the translation of this is, the later part, the translation of the later part is that God has sent His messenger with the religion of truth so that it can make it prevail liyuzhirahu ala dini kullihi over all religions. So if you read until this part, you'll probably come to the conclusion that all religions actually refer to all the religions of the world. But the next clause confines that to the land of Arabia, because you see the next part says, "Walau karihal mushrikun." Even if these mushrikun detest it, even if these people living in Arabia detest it. So the alif lam on the al mushrikun, which is a definite article, defines that now it's not that all religions of the world are being spoken of, it is just the religions of Arabia that were spoken of. So I'm just giving you one example. Otherwise, wherever you'll see that this directive is discussed, there are indications within the verse itself that confine the whole endeavor to the land of Arabia. Now you can of course ask that how come the rest of the people say that it is not confined. The reason is that for them the word al-mushrikun actually refers to all people who are non-Muslims. So, and barring the Hanafites, the Hanafi jurists do not accept this interpretation. But other than them, the rest of them would typically tell you that the word al-mushrik is spoken of all non-Muslims because they indulge in some form of shirk or the other. And then again, that is this question that we have discussed several times, that a person becomes mushrik, or the word al-mushrik is used in the Quran specifically for the idolaters of Arabia because they subscribed to shirk, which means that they confess that yes, we are doing shirk. And so therefore today's non-Muslims, especially if you talk about the Jews and the Christians, and Jews of course they are very strong adherents to monotheism, but if you talk about Christians, even the fact that they associate partners with God, they regard Jesus to be the Son of God, even this does not take them out of the stream of monotheism. They are still called monotheists by the Quran because they explain this whole phenomenon of Trinity to be a form of monotheism. So in the whole corpus of the Quran, you'll not find a single verse in which the Christians are called mushriks. Or the people of the book are called mushriks. They're always addressed by the word in which this stream or this streak of monotheism remains in them. So here lies the basic difference, that they extend the word mushrik to all sorts of non-Muslims, whereas as far as our school is concerned, we say that the word al-mushrik is specifically for the idolaters of Arabia, and they were the ones against whom the Prophet had delivered the truth to the ultimate extent, and they had become guilty of that punishment. So unless the truth was delivered by him to all the other mushriks found in the rest of the world, this could not have happened. So in the absence of that, you cannot extend a directive to the rest of the world, because the Prophet never, I mean, his message, of course, reached them, but the conclusive communication of the truth, which means Itmamul Hujjah, it only took place for the Arabians or the land of Arabia. For the rest, obviously, the matter was in a different way settled. I've just referred to that the Romans and who were the Byzantines and the Persians, they were attacked for this very purpose. But they were not mushriks. And remember, they were people who had denied the truth, and for them, the rule was that either they accept the rule of Islam and pay jizya, or they get ready for war. So that is how I would explain at length that how this difference has arisen.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. We will take one more question. So if you have any question related to the topic, please raise your hand.
Sir, the initial question about the Palestine issue, it was also asked about Syria. If you please guide about Syria also.
It is the same all over. You see, whether it's Syria or it's Kashmir or any other country or Yemen, you see some of the things that have been wrongly introduced, I would say, wrongly understood by many Muslim organizations, is that they think that individual organizations, they also have the authority to wage war. Now, this is an area in which a major departure has taken place. If you look at all the jurists belonging to the Hanafites, the Shafi'ites, the Malikites, and the Hanbalites, you'll see I've written a small article and I've gathered all the opinions and have told them that, look, there is not a single difference of opinion, except in the last few years when this militancy has become very rampant, that jihad or war can be waged without a state. So when militant organizations within a state, they start doing this military activity, then you start violating the Sharia. It is something that cannot be in any way tolerated. And that is what's going on in the first sense. And secondly, when this happens, invariably non-combatants are killed. This again is a grave violation of the Sharia. You just cannot have anything to do with non-combatants. If war has to be waged, then it has to be with the combatants. So these two statutes of the Sharia are being flouted in many lands where Muslims are waging war, and I think they need to rectify this.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We will be concluding our session over here today. Have a great rest of the day. Allah Hafiz.